Welcome to the second topic in Breakthrough Action's video series on effective SPC programming at the nexus of child, early, forced marriage and unions, or CEFMU, and climate change. In this topic, we will discuss advocating for the integration of CEFMU and climate change into policy and program design. This topic consists of 4 videos. In the following 4 videos, we will briefly revisit the dynamic relationship between climate change and CEFMU. The introductory video has a more detailed description of climate change and CEFMU interplay. We will describe how advocacy can increase key role players' understanding of how climate change is increasing levels of violence against children, and we will develop an advocacy strategy using a 10-part framework to influence decision makers to integrate CEFMU and climate change in policies and programs. In this video, we will briefly revisit the dynamic relationship between climate change and CEFMU, define policy advocacy in the context of CEFMU and climate change, introduce the 10-step advocacy strategy framework adapted from a workbook for policy advocacy strategy development. This framework was developed by PATH. Discuss parts 1 and 2 of the strategy development framework, that is, to define your CEFMU and climate change policy issue and draft your policy goal. Let's briefly recap the CEFMU and climate change nexus described in detail in the introduction to this video. In a recent white paper entitled Strategies to End Violence Against Children in a Changing Climate, the author Barn Fonden highlights that climate change exacerbated increases in droughts and water scarcity, floods, natural disasters, and rising temperatures have effects on migration, conflict, poverty, food insecurity, psychosocial health, and stress. These in turn increase the incidence of violence against children, such as child labor, child marriage, sexual abuse, physical abuse, gender-based violence, neglect, trafficking, and mental health issues. From a recent desk review undertaken by Breakthrough Action to explore the interplay between climate change and CEFMU, we found that there's a strong correlation between child marriage and climate change. Climate change has been described as a threat multiplier because it amplifies vulnerabilities, imbalances, and injustices, including gender inequality already present in social systems. Let's look at some additional evidence. As of 2024, it is estimated that 640 million girls and women worldwide were married in childhood. A 2023 report from Save the Children reports that the number of girls at extreme risk of facing the double blow of climate change and child marriage is set to increase 33% to nearly 40 million by 2050. According to the program Girls Not Brides, 12 million girls under the age of 18 are married every year. Additionally, up to 280 million girls alive today are at risk of becoming child brides, and this number could rise to 320 million by 2050 if the current trends continue. Currently, an estimated 30 million adolescent girls live in the top 10 child marriage climate hotspot countries listed on this slide, which are the nations that carry the highest risks that a girl will be both married as a child and experience life-changing climate disasters. These hotspot countries have some of the youngest and fastest growing populations in the world. Yet despite these unequal impacts on girls, less than 2% of national climate plans across the globe mention girls and give explicit and meaningful consideration to the needs and involvement of adolescents. Now we will explore policy advocacy in the context of CEFMU and climate change. Policy advocacy is defined as the deliberate process of informing and influencing decision makers in support of evidence-based policy change and policy implementation, including resource mobilization. Advocacy efforts can call for developing a new policy, updating or amending an existing policy, eliminating a harmful policy, and allocating or committing resources within a budget. In the context of CEFMU and climate change, advocacy efforts can call on decision makers at global, national, and subnational levels to integrate CEFMU and climate change into policies and programs to address the threat to children in a changing climate. Developing a policy strategy for CEFMU and climate change can increase your ability to plan, facilitate, and implement advocacy initiatives to bring about integration of these two often siloed issues. These strategies can form part of a standalone climate change or CEFMU project or larger program working towards ending violence against children. You can enhance your policy strategy by collaborating with colleagues or partners to minimize discussion and the flow of creative ideas. You can enhance your policy strategy by collaborating with colleagues or partners to maximize discussion and the flow of creative ideas. In the upcoming videos, we will explore how you can use the 10-part framework adapted from Part's workbook for policy and advocacy strategy development to craft an advocacy strategy for CEFMU and climate change integration in policies and programs. Now we will discuss parts 1 and 2 of the framework and develop your advocacy issue and advocacy goal for CEFMU and climate change integration. An effective advocacy strategy begins with identifying a clearly defined problem that aligns your organization's existing objectives or naturally extends from your program's work. This alignment enhances the credibility of your advocacy efforts. Your advocacy issue should be grounded in evidence on how climate change impacts the lives of children. For example, you could use local country data to demonstrate the number of girls at extreme risk of facing the double blow of climate change and child marriage by a future date. Your advocacy issue should also state how the proposed policy or program can help to improve the lives of children. For example, reduce violence against children by integrating CEFMU and climate change in policies and programs. It is important to set realistic goals that can be achieved within a 3 to 5 year time frame. Conducting a root cause analysis can be beneficial in thoroughly understanding and defining the problem. Now, let's look at what your CEFMU and climate change policy issue might look like, taking into account the elements of a clearly defined advocacy issue we just discussed. In this example, climate change deepens inequities, disproportionately affects poorer and underprivileged communities, generates increasing patterns of poverty, school dropout, child labor, and climate vulnerability. Using available local country data, you may express your evidence in the following way. The number of girls at extreme risk of facing the double blow of climate change and child marriage in country X is set to increase by X percentage to nearly X by 2050. Using this example, you can now draft your own advocacy issue using relevant country-level evidence to support your advocacy issue. Once you have drafted your advocacy issue, the next step in the framework is to develop your advocacy goal. Defining the advocacy goal helps to focus the advocacy strategy and typically has 4 parts: what, how, who, and when. The what articulates the change you want to achieve. For example, you may want decision makers to acknowledge that climate change is increasing levels of violence against children and integrate CEFMU and climate change in national policies, such as climate, child protection, health, and sexual and reproductive health policies and programs. The how describe what actions decision makers can take to bring about the change you want to see. For example, decision makers can integrate climate consideration in child protection policies and conversely integrate child protection considerations in climate policies. They can also include the voices of children, women, and disadvantaged groups in policy discussions and invest in research that strengthens the evidence around the interplay between CEFMU and climate change. The WHO refers to the names of decision makers' institutions with the authority to make the desired change. For example, you may target decision makers in global health agencies, national governments, global and local donors, research and academic institutions, climate, child protection, and sexual and reproductive health program designers and implementers. The when is the period for when you want to see the change. For example, you may want to urge decision makers to act within a 3 to 5 year time frame. Let's pull all these elements together in an example of a clearly defined CEFMU and climate change advocacy goal. Global, national, and subnational decision makers in climate change, child protection, and health recognize that climate change is exacerbating violence against children. They commit to taking the following actions. Policy integration. Incorporate climate considerations into child protection policies and programs, and vice versa, ensuring child protection is a key component of climate adaptation and mitigation strategies. Increased investment. Boost funding for climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, alongside proven child protection initiatives to create a safer environment for children. Evidence building. Continue to support the development and dissemination of research on the relationship between CEFMU and climate change to inform and strengthen policy and programmatic responses. In the next video, we will go through steps 3 to 7 of PARTS framework for policy advocacy strategy development.
Welcome to video 2 in the topic on advocating for CEFMU and climate change integration in policy and program design. In this video, we will cover parts 3 to 7 of the 10-part framework adapted from a workbook for policy advocacy strategy development by PATH. Specifically, we will discuss identifying decision makers and influencers, understanding key decision makers' interests, recognizing barriers to achieving your advocacy goals, analyzing assets and gaps for realizing your advocacy goals, and finally, selecting your allies and partners. Let's first look at your decision makers. These are the individuals with the authority to realize your advocacy goals. You can find decision makers at various levels, including at global, national, and subnational levels, and within different sectors. Even if one institution holds ultimate authority, decision makers may exist across multiple sectors and government levels. For example, CEFMU and climate change decision makers may include ministries of health, education, environmental protection, social development, agriculture, government and non-government agencies, etc. Key influencers are different to decision makers and are individuals or groups who significantly impact decision makers' actions and opinions. Even with direct access to a decision maker, it can be beneficial to engage those they listen to most, such as professional association representatives, civic leaders, academics, journalists, community groups, celebrities, research institutions, and religious or cultural leaders. Once you have identified the decision makers and influencers, you need to understand their interests and their awareness of and position on your advocacy issue. This will greatly enhance your chances of persuading them to take action and will help to tailor your advocacy activities and messages. Now let's look at your decision makers' interests by discussing their level of awareness of your advocacy issue and what shapes their position on your advocacy issue. A decision maker's level of awareness of the impact of climate change on the lives of children could range from unaware and not familiar to being aware and accurately informed. You can determine a decision maker's position through public voting records, press coverage, and discussions with colleagues. When planning your advocacy strategy, prioritize the decision makers you can persuade. For example, those who are not strongly opposed to child protection or climate change adaptation policies. Remember that many factors may shape the opinion of your target decision maker. This may include the evidence of child marriage, the impact of climate change on the lives of children, societal and cultural norms and religious beliefs around CEFMU, prevailing gender norms, and personal history or experiences with child protection and climate change policies and programs. There may be other barriers to achieving your advocacy goals. Opponents to your advocacy goals can range from those with strong objections, for example, those who support CEFMU, to those with competing priorities. Opposition may stem from a lack of funds, limited staff and capacity, a lack of country-specific evidence, controversial issues, poor coordination between government ministries, entrenched gender norms that support CEFMU, upcoming elections that slow down your efforts, timing of policy revisions, and government resistance to advocacy and the exclusion of civil society organizations. In addition to tackling these obstacles, it is important to identify and understand the motives and tactics of your opponents in order to design strategies that lessen their influence. This might include forming strategic partnerships with trusted organizations or individuals from the same sector as your opponent. To overcome obstacles, anticipate likely challenges and develop realistic, creative plans to address them. In parts 6 and 7 of the framework, we will identify what assets and gaps you have in your organization and select partners to enhance your advocacy efforts. Before planning your advocacy activities to achieve your advocacy goal, you will take stock of your organization's resources and assets to identify gaps and leverage existing strengths. Ideally, the advocacy strategy should align with what your organization already excels at. When taking stock of your organization's assets and gaps, consider resources and expertise that will strengthen your advocacy efforts. This may include working with the media, coalition building and policy analysis expertise, funding, community and social mobilization networks, and organizational reputation for advocacy. Where gaps exist in your organization, partner with other organizations. Remember that advocacy is often more successful when done in partnership. Collaborating with multiple organizations demonstrates broad, diverse support for your advocacy issue, especially if partners come from different sectors. Choose partners who are easy to work with and bring resources that fill gaps in your organization. Remember that strong partners bring few risks, so weigh their strengths against any weaknesses to determine if they are a good partner for collaboration. In the next video, we will discuss Step 8, which focuses on developing your advocacy work plan.
Welcome to video 3 in the topic on advocating for CEFMU and climate change integration in policy and program design. In this video, we will cover part 8 of the 10-part framework for policy advocacy strategy development. Specifically, we will develop an advocacy work plan that includes your advocacy objectives and activities. It is important to have a concrete work plan to achieve your advocacy goal of integrating CEFMU and climate change in policies and programs. Your work plan should articulate your advocacy objectives, the activities you will undertake to achieve your objectives, assign responsibilities, set target dates, and list the partners you intend to work with. Your advocacy objectives are short to medium-term accomplishments that contribute to your overall advocacy goal. Think of advocacy objectives as actions that decision makers, influencers, or key stakeholders might take to show their commitment to the change you want to see. Advocacy objectives identify actions you want others to take. An advocacy objective has 3 parts: what, who, and when. The what is the action they will take, such as supporting the integration of CEFMU and climate change into climate and child protection policies. The who is the person or entity taking the action, for example, the Ministry of Health, religious leaders, or parliamentarians. And the when is the time frame for action, which should ideally be within 5 years. Remember to make your advocacy objectives SMART. Let's revisit the advocacy goal from part 2 of our framework to help us define advocacy objectives. The CEFMU climate change goal is global, national, and subnational decision makers in climate change, child protection, and health recognize that climate change is exacerbating violence against children. They commit to incorporating climate considerations into child protection policies and programs, and vice versa, ensuring that child protection is a key component of climate adaptation strategies. They boost funding for climate adaptation efforts alongside proven child protection initiatives to create a safe environment for children. And they continue to invest in and disseminate research on the relationship between CEFMU and climate change to inform and strengthen policy and programmatic responses. Let's look at some examples of objectives that can help you achieve your overall advocacy goal. The government of country X increases investments in climate mitigation and child protection efforts by 20% by 2028. Research institutions build evidence on the effects of climate change on CEFMU by 2028. Local and international donors increase investment in livelihood resilience by 30% by 2025. Once you have developed your objectives, you can now decide your advocacy activities. Be strategic and targeted to ensure that your activities directly contribute to achieving your objectives and overall advocacy goal. The strongest activities will address the interests of your target decision makers and influencers and move them to act. Let's explore some advocacy activities that you can include in your work plan. Media advocacy includes using mass media channels to reach large numbers of people. These activities can shape public debate around the interplay of CEFMU and climate change and speak directly to influencers, thereby applying pressure on decision makers. Coalition building and networking can mobilize political will, influence policy and financing, and strengthen programs. This allows for resources to be shared and builds relationships between civil society organizations and other stakeholders. Building advocacy champions can advance your advocacy issue. These individuals are influential, credible, and committed to your advocacy goal. Let's look at some examples of advocacy activities undertaken in Sierra Leone by the End Child Marriages Project. The implementing organization engaged extensively with national and subnational level structures, including a parliamentary visit to 3 districts to gather first-hand information on services for survivors of sexual assault and gender-based violence, a consultative meeting with members of parliament, government agencies, and civil society representatives to galvanize support for legislation against early child marriage, and conducted national-level advocacy to pass legislation against early child marriage through the Child Rights Bill, including engagement with the Ministry of Gender and Children's Affairs, the Ministry of Justice Law Officers Department, and legislative and child rights gender committees in Parliament. Once you have identified your advocacy activities, you can now complete your advocacy work plan. This is an example of a template you can use to complete your advocacy work plan. In the top row of each table of your work plan, list your advocacy objective. For each objective, write in column A 2 to 4 activities you will conduct to achieve that objective. In columns B and C, indicate the specific staff and partners who will carry out each activity. In columns D and E, estimate the approximate cost and timeline to complete each activity. In the next and final video in this topic, we will discuss steps 9 and 10 of the Advocacy Development Framework.
Welcome to video 4 in the topic on advocating for CEFMU and climate change integration in policy and program design. In this video, we will record parts 9 and 10 of the 10-part Advocacy Strategy Development Framework. Specifically, we will discuss developing advocacy messages and measuring success. Let's discuss developing your advocacy messages. Advocacy messages translate your advocacy goal into a concise and compelling case for action to a decision maker. It should be no more than 5 to 8 sentences long and take less than 3 minutes to deliver. Your advocacy message should answer these 4 questions. What is your advocacy issue? Why should the decision maker care about your issue? What is the proposed solution and how will it impact the problem? What do you want the decision maker to specifically do following your interaction? Let's look at what your answers to these 4 questions might look like. What is the advocacy issue? Your advocacy issue may be articulated as follows. The climate crisis continues to have a profound impact on children. Climate change is a threat multiplier because it amplifies vulnerabilities, imbalances, and injustices, including gender inequality, already present in social systems. For example, the number of girls at extreme risk of facing the double blow of climate change and child marriage is set to increase 33% to nearly 40 million by 2050. Currently, an estimated 29.9 million adolescent girls live in the top 10 child marriage, climate change hotspot countries, which are the nations that carry the highest risk that a girl will be both married as a child and experience life-changing climate disasters. To answer the question, why should the decision maker care about your issue? You could explain that it is projected that the number of adolescent girls living in the top 10 child marriage climate change hotspot countries will increase to 40 million by 2050, with these hotspot countries having some of the youngest and fastest growing populations in the world. Yet despite these unequal impacts on girls, less than 2% of national climate plans across the globe mention girls and give explicit and meaningful consideration to the needs and involvement of girls. What is the proposed solution and how will it impact the problem? Your proposed solution may include this statement. There is an urgent need to integrate the work on climate and child protection in a more systematic way in policy and program design, and strengthen and build evidence on how climate-affected and degraded environments are influencing levels of violence against children. This will also allow us to better understand the best strategies to protect children. What do you want the decision maker to specifically do following your interaction? To answer this question, you may reflect on Barn Fonden's 4 actions to strengthen current strategies to end violence against children. These include: acknowledge that climate change is increasing levels of violence against children, and strengthen and test the evidence to demonstrate this. Strengthen the prevention of violence against children through livelihood resilience, address social norms, and develop school-based programs. Strengthen prevention and response services to incorporate the increasing risk of violence against children and promote anticipatory action. Listen to, engage, and support children and youth in planning and finding solutions to end violence against children in a changing climate. Let's explore some tips on crafting effective messages. The most effective messages are brief, solution-oriented, and crafted with the decision maker's key interest in mind. Your message should always end with a clear request for your decision maker. For example, integrate CEFMU into climate adaptation strategies. Most decision makers likely won't be able to achieve your entire objective or goal because of one interaction. Therefore, you need to identify achievable intermediate actions for them. For example, ask research institutions to undertake secondary research to explore the interplay between CEFMU and climate change. Remember that there is no one-size-fits-all message. Depending on who you are addressing, you will likely need to adjust your message. For example, you may ask a research institution to do more research on the interplay between CEFMU and climate change versus asking policymakers to integrate CEFMU and climate change in policies. Who delivers your message is just as important as what is contained in the message. The right message delivered by the wrong messenger won't be as compelling. Messengers can be individuals, groups, or organizations. The best messengers have 2 key qualities. They have influence with your decision maker and have expertise on the issue. Your messenger must be informed on the issue and can speak about it easily and with authority from their experience. The final part of an advocacy strategy is to develop a plan to track progress toward achieving your advocacy goal. Measuring this progress will help you to adjust your advocacy strategy as you go and respond to changes in the environment. Demonstrate the value that advocacy can add to an issue or cause. Inform the planning of future advocacy work. mobilize additional resources for advocacy efforts, account for funding and demonstrate results to your donors, and motivate you and your partners to sustain your efforts. Remember that advocacy progress is often measured in terms of outputs and outcomes. Outputs measure productivity, usually quantitatively, and show that the activities you planned actually happened. For example, outputs of your advocacy efforts might be 3 meetings with decision makers or 2 press releases issued. Outcomes measure effectiveness and capture the effects or changes seen because of your activities. Outcomes help to answer the question, what happened as a result of our activities? Examples of outcomes might include a statement of support from a key decision maker, increased government funding allocations, or mentions of your issue in media outlets. To conclude this topic on using a 10-part advocacy strategy for CEFMU in climate change integration, let's revisit some key points. Advocacy for CEFMU in climate change integration calls for the evidence-based integration of climate change into programs that seek to end violence against children. Effective advocacy efforts target governments and international development organizations to focus more on the CEFMU climate change nexus in national and subnational policies and programs, and dedicate more resources to building the evidence around the interplay between climate change and CEFMU. The 10-part strategy development framework discussed in these videos can increase your ability to plan, facilitate, and implement advocacy initiatives to bring about change in policy and programs that can contribute to reducing violence against children. The process of developing a policy strategy is enhanced by collaborating with colleagues or partners to maximize discussion and flow of creative ideas. Thank you for watching these 4 videos on advocating for CEFMU and climate change integration in policy and programs. You may access the resources listed on this slide in the description under this video.